Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to slow everything down and gently step away from the worries of the day. As you settle into bed and let your body begin to relax, I'll be sharing with you the timeless story of Job, a journey through loss, endurance, and quiet restoration. It's a story not just of suffering, but of wisdom and peace, told in a way to help your mind unwind and guide you softly towards sleep. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let your thoughts drift as we begin this gentle nighttime journey together. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live a life so full and good that your very name becomes a whisper of hope for everyone around you? In the ancient land of Uz, cradled between rolling hills and endless stretches of sun-warmed earth, there lived a man named Job, whose days were as golden as the fields he owned. Every morning, the world seemed to rise just to greet him. The sunlight spilled gently through his windows, bathing his home in soft light, while the distant bleating of sheep and the laughter of his children painted the air with the sounds of peace. Job was not just a wealthy man. His flocks of sheep and herds of camels dotted the countryside. His fields were always heavy with grain, and the people of Uz knew his generosity by the bread on their tables and the warmth in his smile. But it wasn't his riches that set Job apart. It was his heart. He was honest in all his dealings, fair to every servant and stranger who crossed his path, and gentle in his words, even when he had reason to be stern. From the moment Job woke, he moved through his home with a sense of calm purpose, tending to each child with a father's loving care. He watched over his 7 sons and 3 daughters as they grew, teaching them kindness and gratitude, sharing in their joys, and guiding them with a steady hand. Family gatherings in Job's home were legendary, a chorus of voices and laughter, the clatter of cups, the glow of lamps in the evening, as stories and songs floated through the night air. After every feast, Job would rise early and offer quiet prayers, thinking of his children and their well-being, offering sacrifices for each one, just in case their hearts had wandered in ways they didn't realize. He never took goodness for granted. Instead, he wrapped his loved ones in prayers, as if tucking them in with a warm blanket before sleep. Job's reputation grew until the very mention of his name brought to mind a man whose life was built on deep roots, faithful, upright, and always turning away from wrongdoing. His friends trusted him, his neighbors respected him, and even strangers could sense a kind of light about him, a gentle strength that inspired both comfort and admiration. His kindness rippled out from his home, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, and there was a quiet happiness in knowing that Job's door was always open to those in need. Still, even in the midst of plenty, Job never allowed pride to creep into his heart. He remembered the simple beginnings of his youth, the days when he had nothing but hope and hard work. That memory shaped him, reminding him to remain humble, to look for those who had less, and to share whatever he could. In the hush of twilight, as the sun dipped behind distant mountains and shadows grew long across his fields, Job would sit beneath the stars, thinking about the wonders of the world. The sky above was vast and deep, each night a quiet promise that life was larger than any one man's story. Even surrounded by family, fortune, and the admiration of his community, Job found time for reflection. He cherished the quiet moments, the ones filled not with noise or busyness, but with a deep and abiding gratitude. It was this spiritless ability to hold on to wonder and to walk gently through the world that made Job's life seem almost enchanted, his soul anchored by peace that no storm could shake. And yet, in the stillness of those perfect nights, neither Job nor those who loved him could know how quickly everything might change. For even the strongest trees can be shaken by unseen winds, and even a life built on goodness can be tested by trials beyond imagination. Far beyond the peaceful fields and gentle laughter of Job's home, beyond the reach of any human ear, there existed a realm unseen, a place where the greatest mysteries of life and fate were quietly shaped. In this invisible space, ancient and profound, the story of Job's life took a turn that no one on earth could have imagined. It was here, in the council of the divine, that the forces of good and evil, hope and doubt, came together, their intentions hidden from mortal eyes. Here, angels gathered, presenting themselves before the Creator, each one bearing witness to the unfolding stories of humanity. In the midst of this gathering, a question arose, one as old as time. What truly lies at the heart of goodness? Is virtue merely a reflection of comfort, or does it shine even in the shadows of suffering? In the silence, one figure stepped forward, the accuser, the adversary, often called Satan. With a voice calm and probing, he asked the question that would change everything. Does Job serve God for nothing? He spoke of Job's fortune, the blessings and protection that surrounded him, and suggested that faith built on prosperity was easily shaken. If the blessings vanished, if hardship replaced ease, would Job's devotion remain, or would he turn away, cursing the very source of all he had cherished? This challenge, whispered in the halls of eternity, became the spark that would ignite a trial unlike any Job had ever faced. Permission was granted, but only within clear bounds. Job's character would be tested, yet his life would be preserved. It was a moment of profound gravity, a decision not made in anger or haste, but as a means to reveal something deeper about the nature of faith itself. For in this mysterious exchange, the question was not merely about Job, but about the strength and resilience that can exist in every human soul. The unseen world leaned in, as if holding its breath, waiting to see if goodness could endure when all visible signs of blessing were swept away. As this silent agreement was made, nothing in Uz betrayed the cosmic conversation taking place. Job awoke, as he always did, with hope and gratitude, unaware that the gentle rhythms of his life were about to shift. The world outside his window was unchanged, peaceful and bright, but above and beyond, the story had quietly turned. This moment marks the beginning of Job's true test, not just of his patience, but of the very foundations upon which he had built his life. The security he had always known was about to be shaken, not by the choices of men, but by the quiet unfolding of a mystery far greater than any he could have imagined. And so, as Job moved through his day with the same kindness, the same love for his children, and the same prayers whispered with hope, he could not see the invisible threads being drawn tight around him. The world he cherished still appeared whole, the laughter in his house just as bright. Yet above the fields, beyond the clouds, a challenge had been spoken and accepted, setting in motion a story that would one day offer comfort and wisdom to generations yet unborn. The peace of Uz held its breath, and the story of Job, the man who would soon face suffering beyond measure, entered its deepest mystery. It began on a day like any other, with the gentle glow of morning settling over the land of Uz. The sky was clear and soft, promising another day of abundance. The world seemed calm and reassuring, the routines of daily life moving like a well-tended garden. Job's servants were already in the fields, his livestock grazing contentedly under the rising sun. His children, full of laughter, were gathered in each other's company, their lives intertwined with joy and celebration. There was no sign of what was about to unfold, no shadow over Job's home or hint in the wind that calamity was near. Yet, in a single day, a sequence of events would begin that would unravel everything Job had known. The first messenger arrived in a rush, his breath quick, his face pale with fear. He stammered the words, each one falling heavy into the stillness of Job's morning. Bandits had come, sweeping down upon the fields where the oxen were ploughing and the donkeys were grazing. The servants tending the animals had been struck down, and the oxen and donkeys carried off in the confusion. Before Job could process the loss or ask a question, another servant stumbled forward, dust still clinging to his robe, eyes wide with terror. Fire had fallen from the sky, he gasped, a storm of flame that devoured the sheep and the shepherds watching over them. There was nothing left but smoke and ash, the gentle sounds of grazing replaced by silence. Even as this second messenger finished his tale, a third hurried to Job, his voice trembling. Raiders from a distant land had attacked, seizing the camels and putting the remaining servants to the sword. One after another, the pillars of Job's prosperity, his livestock, his workers, His security was swept away in the space of mere moments. Yet the day's tragedies were not finished. A fourth messenger, his steps faltering, appeared before Job, carrying news heavier than all the others combined. He spoke of a gathering, a feast at the home of Job's oldest son, where laughter and music had filled the air. Then, without warning, a mighty wind rose up from the desert. It struck the house with furious force, causing the walls to shudder and collapse. In an instant, the celebration was silenced. All of Job's children, his beloved sons and daughters, were gone. The world seemed to tilt, the weight of loss too great for words. Job's heart was battered by grief upon grief, each loss pressing more deeply than the last. The fields outside his home, once full of life, now echoed with absence. The sounds of animals, the voices of his servants, the bright laughter of his children gone, leaving behind a silence that rang in his ears. There was no time to mourn one loss before another struck, no space to breathe between the blows. The ground beneath Job's feet felt suddenly unsteady, as if the very foundation of his life had shifted, and all that he loved had been swept away, like leaves in a storm. Yet, even as the sky darkened with sorrow, Job did not turn from what he believed. He tore his robe, a gesture of grief as ancient as humanity itself, and sank to the ground. His soul trembled with pain, but his spirit reached for words beyond despair. He remembered the simple truth at the heart of life, that everything given can be taken away, that every joy is a gift, not a possession. With a voice breaking but unwavering, Job whispered his acceptance of both fortune and loss. Naked he had come into this world, and naked he would leave it. In that moment, his faith was not rooted in the comforts that had been stripped away, but in a trust that reached beyond understanding, anchoring him even as the storms of sorrow swept across his life. Grief settled over Job's home like a deep, unyielding darkness, pressing into every corner and weighing heavy upon his heart. The world he had known, a world filled with laughter, shared meals, and the gentle music of his children's voices, was suddenly silent. The rooms where his family once gathered felt emptier than ever, haunted by memories of warmth and joy that seemed impossibly distant. Outside, the land that had flourished under his care now mirrored his sorrow, fields quiet and still, the familiar rhythms of work and celebration stilled by loss. Everything Job had poured his love and energy into, all the moments that made up the tapestry of his days, had unraveled in a single, merciless storm of tragedy. It would have been easy, in that suffocating grief, for Job to let bitterness root itself in his soul. It would have been natural to give way to anger or despair, to shake his fist at the heavens, or simply retreat into numbness. Instead, Job let his pain wash over him without resistance, allowing himself to fully feel the weight of his sorrow, not running from it or pretending it wasn't real. In the sacred space of that heartbreak, Job performed an act both ancient and deeply personal. He tore his robe, a symbol of a heart torn by loss, and shaved his head, marking his vulnerability before the mysteries of life and death. Then, with tears falling freely and his body trembling, he lowered himself to the ground. But instead of cursing his fate or turning his sorrow outward in rage, Job bowed low, pressing his forehead to the earth. He whispered words that carried the essence of a faith not built on comfort, but forged in the fires of suffering. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In those words, Job was not denying his pain. He was offering it up, laying it bare before the universe, acknowledging both the fragility and the beauty of existence. As the hours stretched on, the sun tracing slow arcs across the sky, Job remained in that posture of surrender, his spirit both wounded and somehow unbroken. The silence in his home became a kind of sanctuary, a space in which he could grieve honestly, holding nothing back from himself or from God. In this place of mourning, Job was utterly human, broken, bewildered, and yet still able to reach for gratitude, even if it was now lined with tears. For Job understood that everything he had cherished had always been a gift, never truly his to keep, and that gratitude was possible even in the darkest hour. He remembered the laughter of his children, the kindness of his friends, the golden fields of his youth, and instead of bitterness, he allowed memories of joy to mingle with his tears. Night after night, as the stars turned silently overhead, Job's prayers changed. They became softer, more questioning, yet also more honest. He did not hide his anguish from God, nor did he mask his confusion with false cheer. Instead, he laid out his pain like an offering, trusting that it would be seen and understood, even if he could not make sense of it himself. This deep honesty became the heart of Job's worship of faith, that held on, not to answers, but to presence. He did not demand to know why he suffered, or how much longer the darkness would last. He simply let himself be, letting his breathing slow, his thoughts quiet, and his heart rest in the assurance that sorrow could be sacred, too. In this way, Job's suffering became a kind of prayer, his silence a song of trust that drifted gently through the night, echoing through the ages as a reminder that even in our deepest pain, we are not alone. But as the days passed and the wound of loss remained raw, the quiet suffering of Job was not yet at its deepest. Somewhere beyond the reach of human sight, a second conversation stirred in the realm of the unseen, mysterious, and weighty. The question was raised again: was Job's faith truly steadfast, or had he only endured because his own body had been spared? It was one thing to mourn the loss of possessions and loved ones, but what would become of Job's devotion if his own flesh were touched by suffering? If pain crept into his bones and made a home in his body, would his trust remain, or would it finally crumble under the weight of relentless hardship? Permission was granted for another trial, darker and more personal than before. Job would keep his life, but his health, his comfort, even the dignity of his own body would be taken from him. Without warning, a new wave of affliction swept over Job. His skin erupted with painful, itching sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Each movement became agony, his days and nights blending together in a fog of discomfort. There was no relief to be found, no soft bed, no gentle breeze, no healing balm. Job found himself sitting in ashes, the traditional seat of mourning, using a piece of broken pottery to scrape at his wounds, desperate for even a moment's respite from the torment. The simple routines that once filled his day, tending to his flocks, walking among his children, offering prayers at dawn, were lost to him now. His body felt alien and untrustworthy, each breath a reminder of suffering he could neither understand nor escape. As his strength faded, so too did the world's memory of his greatness. Those who had once looked up to Job now shrank away from him, unable to recognize the man who sat in the ashes. Old friends avoided his gaze, children ran from his presence, and servants passed by in silence, unwilling to come near. Job's skin, once touched by sun and wind, was now marred and tender, the pain on the surface nothing compared to the ache inside. Even his own wife, shattered by their shared grief, reached a breaking point. Seeing Job's misery stretch on and on with no sign of comfort or change, she pleaded with him in desperation, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." Her words, raw with sorrow, carried the weight of her own heartbreak and helplessness. But Job, even then, did not surrender to despair. With a quiet voice and eyes filled with tears, he replied, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" He refused to abandon the belief that life's gifts and trials were both part of a greater mystery, that to truly live meant to receive everything with humility. Job's pain was real and overwhelming, but he would not allow it to sever the bond of trust that he held so close. The days crawled by in silence, each one an exercise in endurance, each night a slow struggle toward uneasy sleep. In that lonely, desolate place, stripped of health, honor, and the comfort of companionship, Job clung to the one thing that could not be taken from him: his choice to keep faith. Even when his world had shrunk to a circle of ashes and broken pottery, isolation deepened, yet in this stark solitude, something else was born. The suffering that consumed his body left Job raw and vulnerable, yet it also brought a strange kind of clarity. The man who once commanded fields and feasts was now laid bare, his strength reduced to breath and will. Every heartbeat, Every groan became a small act of resistance, a way of saying that pain, though terrible, would not have the final word. The love that Job still carried in his heart, the memories of his children, and the goodness of days gone by, remained as quiet embers glowing in the ashes. His grief had not destroyed him, nor would his agony. He was battered, unrecognizable, and alone, yet his spirit, though shaken, was not extinguished. In the deepening shadows, Job's story pressed on a testament, not to comfort or certainty, but to the stubborn hope that can survive in even the bleakest places. Loneliness crept into Job's world with a silence as heavy as stone, settling in beside him as he sat on the ash heap, his skin burning and his heart hollowed out by grief. Day after day passed, each one, much like the last, marked by the slow movement of shadows and the sound of the wind rustling through the empty places where laughter used to live. There was no comfort to be found in routine, no small distractions to ease the ache. Everything familiar now felt distant and unreachable. Where once Job's home was filled with the bustling energy of family and the warmth of fellowship, now there was only emptiness. Even the servants who remained in the household moved quietly and kept their distance, offering no words, unable to look their master in the eyes. Their silence was a mirror of the pain they could neither share nor understand. The isolation pressed in until it became almost a presence of its own, cold and relentless, wrapping around Job's weary form. Sleep came only in brief, uneasy spells, and when it did, dreams would sometimes bring memory-soft echoes of his children's laughter, the comforting hand of his wife, or the gentle way the sun rose over his fields in the days before tragedy. But each time he woke, reality returned with cruel clarity, and Job found himself just as alone as before, the ache of longing sharper than any physical pain. In those hours of darkness, questions crowded in, swirling around him with no answers in sight. Why had such suffering come? What did it mean? Was it a punishment, or simply a mystery beyond understanding? Job's mind turned these questions over and over, searching for even the smallest thread of meaning to hold on to. Yet, even as despair tried to settle in his bones, Job's spirit did not collapse entirely. He let the tears come, allowed himself to weep when the loneliness grew too much, and did not try to hide from the sorrow that now shaped his every day. There was something brave in his willingness to face the silence, to admit that he had no solutions, no comfort, no way forward, except to endure. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, when the world around him was completely still, Job would whisper prayers, not the confident, assured prayers of prosperity, but raw, trembling words that rose straight from the center of his brokenness. He did not ask for blessings or demand answers. He simply poured out his longing to be seen, to be remembered, to know that his suffering was not invisible. As the days grew long and the nights longer, even the bond between Job and his wife frayed under the relentless pressure of grief. She, too, had lost everything. The sorrow in her voice was edged with exhaustion and bitterness, her words sharp, but fueled by heartbreak rather than anger. Her presence became scarce, her spirit wounded by loss, and the helplessness of watching the man she loved slip into suffering she could not ease. Job understood her pain, even if her words stung, and his answer to her came not from a place of judgment, but from the depth of a faith that refused to surrender, even as everything around him crumbled. This silent season of Job's suffering, marked by absence and unanswered questions, became a crucible in which his character was refined. Each day he survived became an act of courage, each breath a quiet declaration that he was still here, still choosing to live, even when the world had turned away. In the lonely emptiness, Job learned to sit with sorrow, to let grief have its place, and to trust, somehow, that even in this bleak landscape, he was not forgotten. He began to realize that sometimes the greatest strength is not found in overcoming pain, but in enduring it, in allowing the silence to become a space where new wisdom might quietly take root. And so, the days stretched on, slow and silent, as Job waited for what would come next, held in a solitude deeper than words, yet still tethered, however gently, to hope. News of Job's misfortune drifted far beyond the boundaries of Uz, carried on the lips of travelers, and whispered in the courts and villages of distant lands. The tale was so astonishing, so complete in its devastation, that it seemed almost impossible to believe. In a world where good fortune was often seen as a reward for virtue, and calamity as a sign of wrongdoing, Job's suffering confounded all expectations. It drew the attention of three old friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathitman, who had known Job in days of plenty, who had shared laughter with him under the shade of his vineyards, and spoken with him as equals at the city gates. Each of them, upon hearing of the calamities that had befallen Job, resolved to set aside their own affairs and travel the long, dusty roads to be by his side, united by friendship and the hope of offering comfort, or at the very least, companionship in sorrow. Their journey to Uz was not a short one. As they made their way through the rolling hills and quiet villages, they surely wondered what they would find when they reached Job. Would he be able to speak? Would he welcome their presence, or would grief have closed him off entirely? The closer they drew to Job's home, the more apprehension grew in their hearts. The man they remembered was strong, dignified, always quick with a warm greeting and a gentle word. But when they finally saw him sitting on the ash heap, his skin covered in sores, eyes shadowed by suffering, they were struck silent. The image before them bore so little resemblance to the Job, they knew that they could barely recognize him. The weight of his pain was visible in every line of his body, every motion slowed by exhaustion. In that moment, words failed them. The usual rituals of greeting felt empty, useless in the face of such profound sorrow. Without hesitation or ceremony, the three friends did the only thing that felt true. They joined Job on the ground, lowering themselves beside him, each man letting his own tears fall freely. They sat in silence, not for minutes or hours, but for 7 full days and nights, a gesture that spoke of respect, love, and the willingness to bear witness to suffering that had no easy remedy. No one reached for hollow words or tried to offer answers where there were none. Instead, they honored Job's pain simply by being there, sharing the emptiness with him, allowing the quiet to stretch out as a kind of unspoken prayer. In that space, the silence was not awkward but sacred, a gentle acceptance of the truth that sometimes presence is the only comfort there is. During those days, the friends surely remembered better times, feasts in Job's home, the warmth of wine and song, the quick intelligence of Job's mind, and the joy of children running through the house. These memories floated quietly between them, unspoken but deeply felt, weaving a tapestry of shared history that anchored them all even as the world around Job seemed to fall away. Grief became a companion, shaping their thoughts, binding them together in a bond deeper than words. At night, beneath the slow procession of stars, they might have looked up and wondered at the mysteries that ruled the universe, hoping that the same heavens that had once smiled on Job would someday shine again. There was no timetable for healing, no map for navigating such loss. Yet, in the slow, patient vigil, Job was no longer entirely alone. Even when pain was too great for words, even when hope seemed faint, there was strength in the knowledge that others had come, that love could show itself in the simple act of staying near when everything else had fallen away. When the long hush finally broke, it was not with comfort, but with the raw cry of a heart that could bear no more. The silence of 7 days gave way to words as Job, surrounded by friends who had shared his pain in quiet solidarity, could no longer contain the storm within him. His voice trembled and cracked, shaped by agony and exhaustion, as he cursed the very day of his birth. In a torrent of sorrow, he lamented the hour he first drew breath, wishing that darkness had covered that moment, that he had never entered a world so capable of suffering. Job's lament was not a simple outburst, but a kind of poetry of pain, a deep, honest song that told of a soul searching for answers in a world that now felt senseless and cruel. He wondered why life is given to those whose path is so bitter, why suffering finds its way to those who seek only to do good. It was the kind of question that echoes through the ages, the ache that lives at the center of every broken heart. Hearing the depth of Job's anguish, His friends, who had sat in wordless mourning for so long now, felt compelled to speak. They reached for the wisdom of their traditions, the things they believed to be true about how the world works. Eliphaz, the eldest, was the first to answer, his words gentle but edged with certainty. He reminded Job that suffering does not come from nowhere, that hardship is often the result of hidden faults or forgotten mistakes. He urged Job to search his heart, to confess whatever wrongs might have angered the heavens, to turn back and seek mercy, for surely God restores the penitent. Eliphaz meant well, hoping to guide Job toward understanding, but his words, rooted in a kind of cosmic fairness, could not reach the place where Job's pain lived. Job listened, but the comfort promised by his friend's logic did not find him. He knew, more surely than ever, that his suffering was not the punishment for some secret sin. He had walked with integrity, loved his family, cared for the poor, and honored God in all he did. The thought that his life had somehow invited disaster felt like a fresh wound. But Bildad and Zophar pressed the argument, each in their own way. Bildad insisted that God is always just, that if Job would only plead for mercy, his fortunes would surely be restored. Zophar, the most impatient, even accused Job of arrogance, suggesting that he must have sinned more than he was willing to admit, and that he deserved even greater punishment. Their words, meant to heal, instead stung like salt in an open wound. The conversation became a kind of wrestling match, truth and tradition twisting together in the dust. Job tried to explain his innocence, to defend himself without boasting, but his friends could not accept a world where suffering falls on the blameless. To them, the world was a simple place. Goodness is rewarded, evil is punished, and the righteous have nothing to fear. But Job's story stood in stubborn contradiction to their neat explanations. Each time they spoke, Job's isolation grew. Not only was he cut off by tragedy and illness, but now the comfort of friendship itself was slipping away, replaced by arguments and accusations. He longed for understanding, for a hand to hold his pain instead of judging it, but instead he felt himself drifting even farther from those he loved. In the endless cycle of debate, Job's voice rose with a new honesty. He pleaded for someone to listen, to truly see him as he was, a man broken, searching, yet unwilling to betray his own heart. He asked questions no one could answer, lifting his gaze to the heavens and wondering aloud if God still heard him, if there could be meaning in misery or hope on the other side of despair. The friends clung to their certainties, unable to release their tidy vision of justice, but Job kept searching, reaching for a deeper truth. His pain, now sharpened by the sting of misunderstanding, became a kind of quiet defiance, a refusal to give up on meaning even when all the old answers failed. And so, the long night of questioning stretched on, voices rising and falling like the wind outside, the boundaries between comfort and accusation blurred, as Job's soul struggled for a place to rest. The endless conversation wound on, days stretching into nights and back again, as Job and his friends circled the same weary questions. Job, worn thin by loss and pain, found himself growing more restless with each new speech, for none of their explanations could touch the heart of his suffering. Again and again, they told him that justice was simple, that the innocent prosper and the wicked are brought low, but Job could only look at his life, at the ashes on which he sat, at the scars that marked his body, at the silence left by his children's laughter and know, with a deep certainty, that things were not so clear. He pressed his friends to look beyond easy answers, to see that life was tangled and uncertain, that sometimes the blameless suffer while the cruel walk free. There were moments when Job's voice would break, rough with grief, as he asked why light is given to those in misery, or why the weary must keep struggling when all hope seems lost. Yet beneath his questions, a stubborn spark remained. Job searched for meaning in every shadow, refusing to let his pain close him off entirely from the world. He cried out for justice, longing for someone who could stand between him and God, someone who might carry his plea across the vast gulf that now seemed to separate earth and heaven. Again and again, he spoke of a desire for a mediator, a friend in the unseen places, someone who would argue his case. who would not judge, but simply listen and understand. It was as if Job's suffering had awakened in him a new sense of longing, not just for relief, but for a deeper kind of relationship with the divine that could survive, even when blessings vanished and questions had no answers. In the quietest hours of the night, when even his friends had fallen silent, Job's thoughts circled the same mysteries that haunt every human heart. Why do the innocent sometimes endure so much pain? Why do the wicked so often seem untouched by sorrow, their lives untroubled and full of ease? Job imagined a world where wrongs were righted, where tears were counted, and none went unseen. He spoke of his hope that somewhere, beyond all this confusion, there was a record kept an account of every kindness, every heartbreak, every silent act of endurance. Even as he sat in darkness, Job would not let go of hope completely. He dreamed that someday, somehow, his name would be cleared, his honor restored not just in the eyes of men, but before God himself. Yet as the questions grew sharper, so did Job's honesty. He dared to wonder aloud if perhaps no human could truly understand the ways of the divine. He considered the mystery of creation, the wildness of storms, the quiet power that moves the stars. Still, he could not quiet the ache within his own soul. Again and again, he returned to his longing for justice and mercy, for a sign that he was not abandoned, that his suffering mattered to someone beyond himself. He did not want easy comfort or hollow promises. What Job craved most was truth that could stand in the face of all his pain and not flinch or look away. Through all the searching and all the arguments, Job's spirit remained both battered and resilient. He wept, he doubted, he protested, but he also hoped. His faith had changed, grown rawer and more honest, stripped of certainty, but not of longing. In every question he asked, there was a quiet, defiant refusal to let go of meaning, even when it hid itself in shadow. And so Job sat with his grief and his searching, waiting through the long dark, hoping for a word, a sign, or even just the comfort of being heard by the one who sees all things. For so long, the voices around Job had belonged to the familiar old friends, wise in their own eyes, locked in their certainty about how the world should work. They clung to their convictions like armor, trying to fit Job's pain into shapes they understood, never quite seeing how their words deepened the ache of his isolation. But then, in a moment of quiet that followed, a particularly bitter exchange, another voice emerged. It was the voice of Elihu, a younger man who had been listening all along, absorbing every argument and accusation, every defense and lament, without interrupting. Out of respect for the elders, he had held his tongue, but now, unable to stay silent, he spoke not with accusation, but with a trembling urgency, born of witnessing suffering so intense, it shattered all tidy explanations. Elihu's words were different. He did not blame Job for his sorrow, or insist that the universe was as simple as cause and effect. Instead, he acknowledged the depth of Job's questions, the rawness of his honesty, and then gently offered a new way to look at suffering. He spoke of pain not always as a punishment, but sometimes as a way through which people grow wiser, humbler, more awake to the mysteries that shape their lives. He suggested that suffering can break through pride and open the heart to truths that might otherwise be missed. Elihu saw that Job's anger and sorrow were not simply symptoms of guilt or disbelief. They were part of what it meant to be human, reaching out for understanding in the face of unbearable loss. As Elihu's voice filled the space, the others listened, some with skepticism, some with hope. He spoke about the greatness of God, not as a distant judge waiting to catch people in their faults, but as a living presence who speaks in many ways through whispers, through dreams, through hardship, and through unexpected moments of beauty. Elihu reminded Job and his friends that there are things beyond human wisdom, truths that unfold in their own time and way. He urged Job not to let despair blind him to the possibility of grace, nor to close his heart to the lessons hidden even in the darkest night. With the earnestness of youth and the passion of someone who truly cares, Elihu described how suffering, though painful, can be a tetra voice that calls people to look beyond themselves, to seek wisdom, to listen for guidance in places they might never have looked before. He told Job that even in his agony, he was being shaped and refined, becoming, perhaps, more open to the wonders of the world and the silent goodness that sometimes arrives in the least expected ways. Elihu did not pretend that answers were easy or that pain could always be explained. He simply asked Job to remember that God's ways are vast, that meaning can be hidden, and that patience sometimes leads to the most surprising discoveries. In the gentle hush that followed, the words of the young man hung in the air, mingling with the dust and the light. For Job, it was a strange comfort, not because it wiped away his pain, but because it made space for it, gave it dignity, and hinted at the possibility that suffering could be more than just a burden to survive. As the sun dipped low and the evening breeze stirred, Job felt, perhaps for the first time, that he was not entirely lost. There was a sense, however faint, that he was being seen not just by those who came to offer answers, but by a presence larger than all his questions. Elihu's words did not solve the mystery of Job's suffering, but they softened it, and in their gentleness, a door cracked open, letting in a little more hope. Through the voice of the young friend, the story itself shifted, moving Job and all those who listened one step closer to a truth neither age nor wisdom had yet found. A hush settled over the weary group, lingering like the calm before a summer storm. Job, spent from sorrow and argument, sat still amid the ashes, surrounded by friends who had exhausted all their words. The debates had wound down to silence, questions drifting like dust in the air unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. It was in this breathless quiet, with the air thick with longing and mystery, that something wholly unexpected happened. The sky began to shift, the wind rising from the east, and the darkness that had hovered over Job's life deepened into the tangible promise of a storm. Clouds rolled and churned above the hills, the landscape trembling under the first distant rumble of thunder. Every heart beat a little faster, some with fear, others with anticipation. And then, from the heart of the whirlwind, a voice spoke, a voice unlike any heard before, vast and wild, as old as creation itself. The words that poured forth were not answers in the usual sense. Instead, the voice began with questions, fierce and unyielding, reaching deep into the soul. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? The voice was not angry but awe-inspiring, inviting Job to remember the wonder and grandeur woven into the very fabric of the world. Images tumbled out of oceans bursting forth from their womb, of stars pinned in velvet sky, of snow stored in hidden storehouses, of the morning's first light shaking darkness from the land. The questions kept coming, one after another, painting a picture of a universe both beautiful and bewildering, held together by a wisdom far beyond human understanding. Job listened, heart pounding, as the voice described the birth of mountain goats on distant cliffs, the roaming of wild donkeys across salt deserts, the soaring of eagles on updrafts of invisible air. No creature, no element, was forgotten or overlooked. The voice spoke of the rain falling on lands where no man lives, of constellations wheeling in their cosmic dance, of the intricate paths of the thunderbolt and the gentle softness of dew. Each question was like a riddle, reminding Job of how little he truly knew, not as a rebuke, but as an invitation to awe, to humility, to the kind of wonder that can hold both pain and beauty at once. The storm grew, wind and rain swirling around Job and his friends, drawing them into a living vision of creation's wildness and order. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Can you loosen Orion's belt? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion over the earth? The voice offered no map through suffering, no neat equation to make sense of loss. Instead, it swept Job up into a vision of a world too vast to be contained by simple explanations, a world where chaos and beauty move side by side, and every living thing, behemoth and bird, storm and sunshine, belongs to a greater story. With each revelation, Job's perspective shifted. The world, which had seemed so small, so narrowed by grief, suddenly unfurled around him, immense and dazzling, layered with meaning that went beyond his pain. He realized, in a way that words could never quite capture, that he was part of something far greater than himself. The mysteries that had haunted him, why suffering comes, why good people weep, why answers seem so far away, were not dismissed, but enfolded into a tapestry that reached beyond human sight. The storm, once a threat, became a kind of shelter, a reminder that even the wildest forces were not beyond the care of the one who called forth the morning and set boundaries for the sea. The voice from the whirlwind did not belittle Job's suffering. Instead, it dignified it, placing it alongside the mysteries of creation and the endless turning of the stars. In the presence of such majesty, Job's questions did not vanish, but they softened, transformed by wonder and humility. For the first time since his troubles began, Job felt himself held not by answers, but by a presence larger and kinder than he had ever imagined. The storm raged on, but inside it, a new kind of peace began to take root, tender and unshakable, promising that even in the heart of chaos, there was wisdom and love enough to hold the world together. The world, once small and hemmed in by pain, had opened up before Job into a vastness he could never have imagined. The wildness of the storm, the voice that thundered from within it, had drawn him beyond the tight circle of his grief and placed him at the center of a universe rich with wonder, teeming with mysteries he could not begin to grasp. And now, in the wake of that voice softened by awe, hushed by humility, Job was left with a new understanding. He no longer clung to his old certainty, no longer demanded an explanation for every sorrow or answer for every question. Instead, he bowed low, surrendering the burden of having to know, laying down the fierce insistence that the world make sense to his wounded heart. There was no trace of pride in him, nothing left of the old urge to defend himself or prove his innocence. With the dust still swirling and the taste of rain on his lips, Job whispered his response, quiet, but full of truth. He confessed that he had spoken of things too wonderful for him, things far beyond his comprehension. The ache that had so long filled his prayers, the hunger for answers, the longing for justice, the desperate need to be heard, began to dissolve into something gentler, something that felt like trust. He admitted that, before the storm, he had only heard stories of the greatness and nearness of God, but now, having stood in the heart of the whirlwind, he felt as if his eyes had truly seen. The presence that once felt so far away had drawn close, not to erase his suffering, but to give it a new meaning. Job's humility was not the crumbling of a spirit, but the quiet blooming of wisdom, a deep acceptance of mystery, a surrender to the vastness of a love that holds all things, even sorrow, within its embrace. In that posture of humility, Job discovered a new kind of peace, one that did not depend on the return of health or wealth, nor on the restoration of reputation. It was a peace born in the center of not knowing, a quiet assurance that his life, with all its loss and longing, was still watched over by a care deeper than the storms he'd faced. He no longer tried to untangle the reasons for his suffering, nor to justify himself before the universe. Instead, he allowed his heart to rest, to be still in the mystery, trusting that he was seen and held, even when the answers remained hidden. The questions that once pressed so hard against his chest became lighter, gentler, as if they too were being carried on the wind. Job's friends, who had spent so long arguing and accusing, fell silent in the wake of this transformation. They saw in Job not a defeated man, but one who had been changed by an encounter with something holy, an encounter that demanded no explanations, only awe. Even they felt the shift, sensing that they too had missed something vital in their rush to explain, to judge, to be right. The presence that had met Job in the storm now lingered, filling the quiet air with a sense of grace. There was nothing left to prove, nothing more to defend. In the heart of mystery, Job had found a wisdom deeper than knowledge, and a peace stronger than suffering, peace that asked nothing, explained nothing, but simply remained, gentle and real, as steady as the morning after the rain. In the quiet that followed the storm, something shifted, not only in Job's spirit, but in the very air around him. The ache in his heart was still there, the emptiness left by his children, and the memories of all that he had lost, but it was softened now by a kind of gentle surrender. Job remained in his humility, no longer demanding answers, no longer clinging to his suffering as proof of his innocence or measure of his pain. And in that posture of humility, something remarkable unfolded, an unexpected act of grace, as mysterious and beautiful as the voice that had spoken from the whirlwind. Wordless, the world around Job began to move toward restoration. But first, there was an act of reconciliation, as the friends who had tried so hard to comfort him, but instead deepened his wounds, found themselves confronted by their own limitations. They, too, were humbled, their words now exposed as incomplete, their certainties made small by the enormity of what Job had endured and the majesty of what had been revealed. Yet instead of turning away or casting blame, Job was invited to take on a new role of intercession and forgiveness. God asked Job to pray for his friends, to stand in the place of peace, and offer a blessing for those whose good intentions had missed the mark. And Job, with a heart softened by suffering, did not hesitate. He prayed for his friends, asking for mercy on their behalf, letting go of any bitterness or resentment, allowing grace to flow through him into the brokenness that they, too, carried. In that act of prayer, Job's story began to turn from sorrow to hope, from loss to restoration. It was not a sudden reversal or a simple return to the past, but the slow, careful work of Hellinger rebuilding that honored every tear, every wound, every moment of despair that had shaped the journey. With time, signs of blessing began to return to Job's life. The land that had once seemed barren stirred with new life. Green shoots emerged where ashes had fallen, and the familiar rhythms of work and harvest found their way back into the days. Friends and relatives who had once stood at a distance now returned, bringing gifts and comfort, gathering in Job's home to share food, laughter, and the gentle assurance that life could be good again. For Job, every moment of kindness, every echo of music in his house, felt like a miracle proof that after devastation, love can return in ways both familiar and new. He found himself surrounded once more by abundant Sino, as a reward for endurance, but as an expression of love that moves through the world without logic or condition, a blessing that cannot be earned but only received. Job's family grew again, his days filled with the voices of sons and daughters, the laughter of grandchildren, and the bustle of shared meals. His fortunes were restored, and then Sominot, because he demanded it, but because his heart was open to whatever the future might bring. The memory of loss did not vanish, nor did the grief for those he had lost, but it was now held alongside gratitude, woven into the fabric of a life that had been broken and made whole again. In time, Job became a man whose story was not only one of suffering, but also of restoration and wisdom, a living testament to the possibility of hope after sorrow. He saw his children's children to the fourth generation, the days of his old age marked by peace, humility, and a kind of quiet wonder that only those who have walked through darkness can truly know. And so, the restoration was not just a return to what had been, but the creation of something new, an answer, not to every question, but to the longing of the heart, for healing, for reconciliation, and for the gentle beauty of life after loss. The years unfolded quietly, each one leaving its own gentle mark on the landscape of Job's life. Seasons came and went, painting the hills of Uz with green and gold, then covering them with the hush of winter snow. And through it all, Job walked with a humility that was deeper than before, a gratitude that sprang from the very roots of his being. He had known suffering intimately, its weight and silence, its ability to strip away all illusions. Yet, what remained after the storms passed was not just a return to what had been lost, but a new way of seeing the world, a wisdom that glowed softly in everything he did. He looked at his family and saw not just faces and laughter, but the miracle of their presence, the treasure of each ordinary day. He walked his fields and tended his flocks, not with the pride of a wealthy landowner, but with the gentleness of someone who understood the fragility of every gift. Job's heart was quieter now, more easily moved by kindness, more willing to forgive. He became a source of comfort to others, not because his own pain was forgotten, but because he understood so well what it meant to hurt, to question, to hope when all seemed lost. People came to him for counsel, for a word of encouragement, for the simple reassurance that they were not alone in their struggles. Job listened patiently, never rushing to offer easy answers, always allowing space for silence, for tears, for the mystery of sorrow and the slow, surprising bloom of hope. His story, once whispered in fear and pity, became instead a lantern for those traveling their own dark roads of promise, that wisdom could be born from suffering, that gentleness could emerge from loss. The wisdom that Job carried was not the kind that could be taught in a single lesson or handed down like an inheritance. It was the kind that comes from sitting in the dust and letting sorrow shape you, from asking questions without answers and learning to wait in the silence. Job knew now that there were some things that could never be fully understood, that pain and joy were often tangled together, inseparable in the pattern of a life. He came to see that every story held moments of both, that no heart was untouched by the turning of fortune, and that true peace was found not in escaping sorrow, but in making room for it, allowing it to soften pride, deepen empathy, and open the way for gratitude. As he watched his grandchildren play in the sunlight, Job's eyes would sometimes fill with tear snot, just of sadness for those he had lost, but of wonder at the beauty that still remained, the way the world continued to offer sweetness, even after bitterness. He cherished every sunrise, every shared meal, every song drifting through his home. He learned to treasure small joys, the warmth of a hand, the laughter of children, the quiet of the evening as gifts more precious than any wealth. And in the long, peaceful days of his later years, Job understood at last that wisdom was less about knowing why things happened and more about learning how to love in their midst. He found a freedom in releasing the need for answers, resting instead in the assurance that he was known and cared for, even when life was shrouded in mystery. Through it all, Job's story grew into a songone that spoke not only of suffering and restoration, but of the hidden strength that carries people through the hardest seasons. He became, in the eyes of his family and all who knew him, a living reminder that sorrow and joy can exist together, that patience is its own kind of courage, and that the greatest wisdom is often found in the gentlest hearts. The pain he had endured was never erased, but it was transformed, becoming the ground from which hope and peace could rise. And in that quiet, golden wisdom, Job discovered a contentment deeper than any happiness he had ever known. Contentment rooted not in answers, but in the steady embrace of life, in all its sorrow and wonder. Let your mind drift now to the peaceful hills and gentle valleys, where the story of Job draws quietly to its close. The sun sets slowly over Uz, painting the sky in soft gold and deep lavender, casting long, warm shadows over fields that have known both abundance and loss. The sounds of the day children's laughter, the bleating of sheep, the distant call of birds begin to fade into the hush of evening, replaced by a deeper stillness, a sense of rest that settles over every corner of the land. Within Job's home, the tables are cleared, the hearth glows softly, and the voices of family gather one last time to share stories, simple joys, and the gentle comfort that comes with being together. The burdens of the past have not disappeared, but they have found their place within the fabric of each heart, woven into the warmth and wisdom that now fill the rooms. Job, older now, sits surrounded by his children's children, his gaze steady and calm, his eyes reflecting a light that comes from within a light, kindled by sorrow and tempered by grace. As darkness falls and the stars awaken one by one, there is a feeling in the air of things made whole, of wounds that have healed not by forgetting, but by being remembered and held gently over time. The wind moves through the trees like a lullaby, carrying the fragrance of earth and flowers and the promise of peaceful rest. Inside, the house grows quiet, the last candles flicker and fade, and everyone finds their place beneath warm blankets, hearts stilled by the rhythm of breathing and the quiet certainty that night brings. You too, Listening now can let yourself sink into this stillness, knowing that in the grand tapestry of life, every trial, every tear, every hope and joy has meaning beyond what you can see. The story of Job becomes, in these gentle closing moments, a kind of Blessinga reminder that suffering, though real, is never the final word, and that even after the hardest night, morning always comes. As sleep begins to claim you, allow the lessons of Job's journey to settle softly in your heart. Feel the peace that comes from letting go, from trusting that you are carried through the darkest seasons by a love that is patient and deep. Remember that wisdom grows slowly, like roots beneath the surface, and that it is nourished not just by happiness, but by every moment of endurance and quiet hope. Let yourself imagine the world as Job came to see it, full of wonder and questions, yet anchored by the knowledge that you are never truly alone. Each breath is a gift, each day a chance to begin again, each sorrow an invitation to deeper compassion. Drift now into dreams, feeling the weight of worry slip away, knowing that rest is not a weakness, but a necessary kindness, a way of honoring both the struggle and the beauty of being alive. The past is safe, the future unwritten, and in this moment, you are exactly where you are meant to be, peace, cradled by the mystery and mercy that fill the world. Let your mind wander across fields of gold, beneath skies scattered with stars, hearing in the quiet the distant echo of a story as old as time and as new as tomorrow's dawn. Sleep, knowing that like Job, you are held in the heart of the story, your journey precious, your spirit strong, and your soul surrounded always by hope.